Hello, welcome to Shelter in Solidarity's Saturday Bookshelf Show, April 29th. We are here today with Jenny Bonnevier, who is a senior lecturer in English and American literature at Örebro University with a focus on feminist theory, in particular material feminisms. Her research focuses on kinship formations in American popular culture, and her recently co-edited anthology with Berit Ostrom, Kinship in the Fiction of N.K. Jemisin, Relations of Power and Resistance, has just been published with Lexington Books. And she's beginning a new, I believe she and Berit are beginning a new research project, Circuits of Care, AI, and Kinship in Speculative Fiction. I am Mark Soderstrom, coming to you from a rainy Syracuse, New York, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Berit. What I would really love for us to sort of open is we want to start sort of thinking about the work of N.K. Jemisin as our platform, but I hope we don't limit ourselves to just N.K. Jemisin today, to have a broader conversation. But I would love if we could start with some of Jemisin's voice, so that people have an idea of Jemisin's work. Jenny, would you be willing to read a passage from N.K. Jemisin's work to start us off today?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. And thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I've chosen a passage from the novel The Fifth Season, which is the first book of her Broken Earth trilogy. The work of Jemisin's that has, got the most attention, the sort of that has had the greatest impact on the science fiction field, definitely. It was hard to choose, but this is from pretty early in the novel, where one of the main characters, I should say, Damaya, is being picked up by an unknown man, collected by this unknown man. So I'll just read it and we can talk more about the context afterwards. Well, that's that, says the child buyer as they reach Mother on the ground floor. Mother sighs at the sight of her, perhaps in exasperation. If you could assemble a package for her, 1 or 2 changes of clothing, any travel food you can provide, a coat, we'll be on our way. Mother draws up in surprise. We gave away her coat. Gave it away in winter. He speaks mildly, but Mother looks abruptly uncomfortable. She's got a cousin who needed it. We don't all have wardrobes full of fancy clothes to spare. And here Mother hesitates, glancing at Damaya. Damaya just looks away. She doesn't want to see if Mother looks sorry for giving away the coat. She especially doesn't want to see if Mother's not sorry. And you've heard that origins don't feel cold the way others do, says the man with a weary sigh. That's a myth. I assume you've seen your daughter take cold before. Oh, Mother looks flustered. Yes, but I thought that the Maya might have been faking it. That was what she'd said to the Maya that first day, after she got home from creche and while they were setting her up in the barn. Mother had rage, her face streaked with tears, while father just sat there, silent and white-lipped. The Maya had hidden it from them, Mother said, hidden everything, pretended to be a child when she was really a monster. That was what monsters did. She had always known there was something wrong with Maya. She had always been such a little liar. The man shakes his head. Nevertheless, she will need some protection against the cold. It will grow warmer as we approach the equatorials, but we'll be weeks on the road getting there. Mother's jaw flexes. So you're really taking her to the younginess then? Of course the man stares at her. He glances at the Maya. They both look at the Maya, their gazes like an itch. She squirms. So even thinking I was coming to kill your daughter, you had the calm headman summon me. Mother tenses. I didn't, at her sides, her hands flex. Then she bows her head, as if she is ashamed, which the Maya knows is a lie. Mother isn't ashamed of anything she's done. If she was, why would she do it? Ordinary people can't take care of children like her, says Mother, very softly. Her eyes dart to the Maya's once and away fast. She almost killed a boy at school. We've got another child, and neighbors, and abruptly she squares her shoulders, lifting her chin. And it's any citizen's duty, isn't it?
That's a really amazing passage, sort of in the context, and so sort of powerfully linked to the sort of themes of kinship and family. And that one has always resonated with me as the experience of queer children in the family, right? And who are discovered by, conservative parents, and then who become, as Demaya had gone from child to have always been a monster, or have always had lied. The transformation there is, to me, gives me chills.
Yeah.
And shows sort of Jemisin's really powerful voice at giving just enough detail for you to fill in. What motivated you to pick that passage?
I think, you've touched on some of the reasons already, that this switch from from being inside to being outside, from being recognized as kin to being monstrous, and the way that it sort of just challenges all our ideas about family and motherhood also, because it's a mother, and I think that's important here, as sort of embodying this unconditional love, where here you see the sort of the fine line between or the precarity perhaps of family relations, the way that you are always at risk of being excluded. And so that's part of it. The other thing is why I chose to end where I ended, is that to me it highlights what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of kinship. It is the way that it moves from the very intimate, very personal, to sort of the institution, to family as an institution, as part of social structures, and as something that you become a citizen in a way. You become part of a sort of a nation, a state, through kinship relations. So the way that she moves from sort of where her role as a citizen becomes central to what she did, it was her duty. And that sort of conflation in a way of motherhood with citizenship, I think it's interesting. And I think that Jemisin, that her whole work keeps doing these sort of enmeshing our most intimate relations in that kind of institutional, for lack of a better word here, but the way, the way in which it is family is never sort of innocently personal, but always socially embedded.
Right. We get trained to think of it as an intimate, personal piece, but it's an institution inside other institutions and in support of other institutions so often. What N.K. Jemisin, the Broken Earth trilogy is an amazing piece of Jemisin's work, and stunning, right? I mean, it wins a Hugo. The first person to win a Hugo back to back to back for each book of a trilogy had never been done in the history of the award. It's a stunning collection. But your collection on kinship in N.K. Jemisin is more than just the Broken Earth trilogy. But what sort of motivated you around N.K. Jemisin's work to dedicate an entire collection to one author? What about her work drew you?
Well, so many things. I mean, one was the status that she achieved in the field, and what she did that you just talked about with the Broken Earth trilogy. But but also that she is a very productive author. There's so much more. I mean, we saw in the opening here all her novels, and she's also a short story writer and a comic writer. So she's very, very productive. So there's a richness there that was, of course, appealing, enticing, but also in terms of the richness of her texts, I find them challenging. I think a lot of readers do. She doesn't make it easy for readers. She forces us, I would say, to stay with discomfort. She doesn't flinch from what is hard and harsh and difficult. But at the same time, I find her work hopeful. And to me, that sort of that combination of recognizing pain and oppression, but maintaining a sense of hopefulness was something that drew me personally to her work. Also, when Beard and I started talking, we realized that there were so many potential approaches to understanding kinship and the way that it works in Jemisin's text, that we felt that, I'm saying, why only one book? There should be more. There's so much more. It could have been longer. There could have been a second part as well. There's so much to explore there.
I should mention for people who might not know that the Hugo is one of the most prestigious awards in speculative fiction, and it is unique in that it is an award chosen by readers and fans. So winning a Hugo is a very important thing for authors, and
yeah, it really is. And we might get back to that when if we talk about sort of Afrofuturism and race a bit more. But it's also worth mentioning that she won facing a sort of alt-right kind of racist movement that tried to sort of safeguard science fiction or speculative fiction from like the advances of people of color, BIPOC people, LGBTQI communities, etc. So sort of in the face of that kind of hostility, she still won, and I think that says something both about her work and about the community of speculative fiction readers.
right, yeah.
Resisted that. It's sometimes referred to as Puppygate. More about that later, perhaps, but That was an interesting and important moment, I think, for speculative fiction generally.
I will write down that we need to return to Puppygate. We can leave people in suspense after about something called Puppygate until later. But yes, I think it's a really important, as you know, Jemisin's work is really important in part for who Jemisin is, and signaling a sort of new contestation in the genre, broader. Um, so many things, so many places to think about. But I'd like to sort of keep with your collection for a moment and think about the kinship side, right? It's in the work of N.K. Jemisin, but it is also kinship in the work of N.K. Jemisin. And many, we have a lot of people writing sort of about race issues in N.K. Jemisin that we should get to later, or climate issues in N.K. Jemisin. But here you have chosen sort of the lens of kinship, and that isn't, I think, intuitive to a lot of people when they look at Jemisin's work. What about kinship helps us think about Jemisin, and what is it about using kinship that you see as sort of transformative, right? What is it that's liberatory about using kinship as a lens to look at the work of someone like Jemisin?
Well,
Oh, I hope I didn't load too much into that question. You've just got me thinking now.
yeah. Yeah, okay. And I just saw that there was a question in the chat that kinship is different than clan and tribe and so on. Yeah, I think, okay, so kinship is as a term, it comes from anthropology. So it's sort of an anthropological take on sort of understanding how people sort of organize their relationships to each other. And as that, in that way, then, as I've already sort of touched on, it's intimately connected to things we term as communities or societies or nations or states, right? It is about organizing people and deciding what kind of relationships matter and how they matter legally, economically, how they matter in terms of labor and division of labor. So the labor of care, how is that distributed? Who carries that, or who should do that kind of labor, right? So for me, there's a quote that I use sometimes when I introduce kinship by Judith Butler when she writes about the play Antigone. She says that, and I think I'm quoting her correctly, she asked whether there can be kinship. And by kinship, I don't mean the family in any specific form without the support and mediation of the state, and whether there can be the state without the family as its support and mediation. And to me, that is where the sort of rewards of kinship lies, is that it enables you to discuss these connections between the very intimate and the political, legal, economic. And for me, kinship comes in many forms, and they are, so it's not, it's not as if kinship in itself is something that is transformative, but it structures both how we enter the world. So if we want to change that, if we want to transform that, I would say that we have to transform kinship, right? That it is sort of a key into thinking about social transformation, social or revolution, if you want. So in terms of Jemisin's work and the why kinship is particularly important there, I think that there's something about the intersections in Jemisin's work between gender, race, but also class and like the organization of labor, that to me highlights kinship. That I don't know quite how to put this straightforwardly, but her characters are constantly changing, being pushed into change they don't want, or changing sort of because they want it. I mean, it's more, you find more characters in Jemisin who are sort of pushed into changing. They have to change. They are forced to change. And that I see Kinship working in Jemisin to support people through those changes, to enable sort of survival through that kind of change. And to me, that says something about the sort of potentially transformative role that Kinship can play, is that it can support people through change that is painful, because change is painful. We, you know, even if it's, or I would say, you know, it's hard to generalize and say just that all change is painful, but it tends to be. I don't know. I've been rambling a bit now, so that's not an answer. But what would you like to add to that or comment?
You know, I think what resonated with me thinking about Kinship in Jemisin was the powerful critique she had in terms of the poverty of our current family form and the paucity of care that our current family form offers us, and that there could be so many more rich alternatives, right? But her critique of what we have, I think, is powerful, right? Alexandra Kollontai said it's hard to envision giving up this sort of paucity of security to leap towards a utopia of abundance that we can't see when it comes to changing kinship in the family, right? So I think her opening to us of a critique of the family could be so much more. What we have is the mother in Demaya, right? Serving the institution and ready to give her daughter over to death when her daughter is, you know, not what she expected, queered in some way. And so I think that critical lens that Jemisin can offer, because it's speculative fiction and it doesn't have to pretend to realism, right? But I think building on that, I think, you know, you mention issues of race, you mention issues of family, you mention issues of class, you mention issues of gender and labor. And, you know, when I tell people that I read speculative fiction or I work on speculative fiction, this is not what springs to their mind, right? And I think that sort of circles us back to Puppygate, right? You know, so many people, when I say I work on speculative fiction, they think, oh, boys with toys, boys with rocket ships, and we know what rocket ships look like. You know, and I think that perhaps thinking about Puppygate, because it opens up that transformation in speculative fiction, which has been there but has become more public, right? And I think, you know, Puppygate was an organized attempt to control the Hugos by a fairly reactionary white male group, led the rabid puppies, led by Theodore Beale, the son of the Finger Hut millionaire. So they had some economic power as well. And Theodore Beale particularly attacked Jemisin as an African American woman, calling her at one point a half savage who couldn't possibly really understand science fiction, which he referred to as rockets and colonial white men going out into space and conquering planets. But I think, you know, Jemisin, as a even though she doesn't always call herself an Afrofuturist, I think, you know, Afrofuturism is one category that we can see challenging, and LGBTQ authors, Native American authors. There's not really a question there, but I find it to be a really exciting time as these sort of small subgenres that have been around for a century, but are actually getting more attention and more awards and becoming important enough that people are attacking them. Right? I think there's almost a parallel with what's going on in society with the backlash. between what we see broadly in politics and what we saw in Puppygate, Rabid and Sad
Yeah.
Puppies.
And I mean, there are, like you mentioned as well, there are direct links between the two. I mean, science fiction or speculative fiction isn't a world, a separate world that is sort of, not affected by what goes on in society at large. It is part of it's part of the culture wars. It is part of the like you that the backlash that you mentioned, definitely very visible in the field of speculative fiction. But it's been heartening, I think, to see the way in which speculative fiction, both in terms of writers, but also publishers, academics, etc., have really worked against that backlash, so to speak, and I think pretty successfully. But as long as the genre has existed, and you can debate how long that is, it's always hard to pinpoint the origins of something, and that's also a sort of an exercise of power to do that. But there's been this debate, there's been this sort of group of people who wanted to safeguard what they see as their sort of their home, their hometown, or their space that needs to be sort of safe from. I was looking back at some 1920s and 1930s discussions of science fiction in the pulp magazines. It's usually called pulp SF period, right? When in the US, when science fiction really starts thinking of itself as a genre. And you have, if you read the letters section there, you have really interesting letters with slogans like more science and less females in science fiction, for example. And, also serious science fiction writers who respond to calls for more women in science fiction, in the science fiction stories, saying that, why on earth would there be more women in these stories? They are about space exploration and science and things that men do. So you can't expect us to bring romance into the stories. And that assumption that anytime you bring in a woman, you bring in romance is, interesting when we read it from our perspective. But it was very dominant then. And now I'm thinking about women and the sort of women's movements and the feminist work within the genre. But we should also recognize, I think, that feminism was very much white middle class feminism at that point. And that's what I think is so wonderful with what we're seeing now, is that we are both feminists and speculative fiction generally, and recognize the importance of diversity in a way that I think is significantly different. It's always dangerous to talk about new things, but I find this to be pretty new in terms of the genre history.
Yeah, I think one of the sad puppies might have been Brad Torgerson complained about these people destroy science fiction, right? And it's so encouraging to see publishers come back with collections labeled queers destroy science fiction, lesbians destroy science fiction, disabled people destroy science fiction, almost celebrating this sort of inclusivity and challenge. And as opposed to sort of succumbing to this, we need to continue to serve this male conservative audience, almost challenging them to leave, right?
Exactly. And I think the outcome of the Hugo Awards, not just that Jemisin won, but also in the other categories, where almost I think there was only really one of the works that were nominated by this Puppygate movement actually won. I think that was Guardians of the Galaxy, which people said they kind of liked anyway. I mean, it wasn't clearly, it wasn't that the Puppygate people actually, carried the day. It was more that people said, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that this is like white male supremacy, there's a lot of diversity going on in Guardians of the Galaxy as well, we could definitely argue. So so I think that's also a sign that, that they are becoming more relevant, which isn't to say that it isn't, it's a form of violence that is sort of exercised within the field, and it's hard to be a writer, a BIPOC writer, or just as soon as you don't fit into that category, you will have to meet different kinds of hate and reactionary bullshit to be.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh no, just sort of thinking I don't have lists in front of me, but it seems to me in the years following Puppygate, there's almost been I think women have almost swept most of the nominations for the major awards in terms of novel and novella, which are some of the major awards is really the novel.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's exciting to see an expansion. But I think I'd like to come back to, you talked a little bit about, I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to argue about the origin of science fiction. Personally, I'm fine thinking that the origin was a woman author and the book was Frankenstein, and just move from there. But I know that's controversial, but it's but I think for a lot of people, again, the idea that there is a tradition of feminist science fiction, that it's been really a lively subfield and an important subfield, is new to a variety of people. And I think you have done some work in that, to think back. And would you give us sort of your perspective to think a little bit about what is the trajectory of feminist science fiction that leads us to be able to think critically about a woman author writing about kinship and family? What's a little bit of the history of feminist science fiction for people who might not know?
Yeah. Okay. So this is a topic that could be its own lecture or two series. So I'm not going to lecture, but I am going to just suggest a few things. And what I'd like to suggest is that the women were always there. There have always been women writers and women readers, and the sort of male majority in early science fiction has always been appeared equally surprised anytime they discover that that's the case. You referenced Frankenstein, Mary was Frankenstein, and that is, one of those sort of starting points that have been suggested. And when you start with Frankenstein, you create a sort of a lineage of science fiction which is concerned with the sort of problems of science, that questions, how can we use science and technology. It concerns itself with things like reproduction, with the creation of life, in ways that sort of, to me, you then sort of draw a different sort of developmental or a different lineage up to people like the feminist second, part of the feminist second wave feminism of the 60s and 70s with Ursula Le Guin and Joanna Russ, Susan McKee-Charnas, and so on. And there you have like concerns in common, but they also go, people that I like to include in that line of development would be C.L. Moore, who's written a wonderful short story, No Woman Born, in the 1940s, I think, but I might be wrong, might be 30s, but I think it's 40s. Judith Merrill is another name that we should recognize, I think, in this story. And then, these women often wrote without signaling that they were women, CR, but we also have people like James Tiptree, which is a pseudonym for a woman writer, and so on. So we have we have that sense that women were always there, but there definitely is a moment in the late 60s and early 70s where things changed, and that was with Le Guin and Russ and Chalmers and other people as well. And eventually, a few years later, Octavia Butler, who was one other sort of key figures, late 70s is when she starts producing. And from that point on, I would say that the women are there. They cannot be ignored anymore. You can't sort of hide them between or behind these sort of male pseudonyms or pretend like science fiction doesn't include women. What happens is that you get a story of soft science fiction. So that becomes a label that you put on work that isn't real science fiction, hard science fiction. So you sort of try to create a ghetto of women writers, I would say. But my understanding is that what we're seeing today is that has very much failed, that what women writers are doing, and increasingly diverse sort of groups of women writers who they are in terms of other aspects of identity, more diverse, they've become central, I think, in ways where you see this kind of backlash that we talked about.
Yeah, even into the 80s, there are women publishing under pseudonyms, or C.J. Cherry changes her name, right? And because she writes fantasy on the one hand, but she writes hard science fiction on the other, and her publisher tells her to change her name to drop actual name and publish under C.J. so people would think she was a male writer writing hard science fiction.
Yeah.
And speaking of C.J. Cherry, one of her issues is cloning, right? And reproduction through cloning and training how to socially reproduce people even when they are, clones as opposed to out of biological family units. It's a really interesting aspect of Cherry's work. Sort of circling back to thinking a little bit about kinship and family, it seems Marge Piercy was also a guest on this show.
Yes.
And of course, her work, Woman on the Edge of Time, is, so important to thinking about social reproduction and reproduction issues. But it does sort of seem amazing at this moment to be a speculative fiction writer when the family is undergoing changes by technologies that were speculative fiction not that long ago. We've moved through surrogacy and baby M to now in vivo surrogacy, to work on artificial wombs. What are your sort of thoughts about this moment and reproductive technology in science fiction? How does science fiction help us think about adjusting to new reproductive technologies?
Yeah, I think I would say I've just finished an article looking at Piercy and Russ and Le Guin and their sort of take on reproductive technologies in these 70s classics. Because it's my sense of Woman on the Edge of Time, The Female Man by Joanna Russ, and then Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness. And I would say that it's very clear at that point that feminism is really engaging with reproductive technologies as a possibility, as sort of a potential revolutionary technology. And they're drawing very much on Shalomit Firestone and her ideas that we need to, that's sort of the root of all oppression, really. Is pregnancy, to put it very simply. So we need to move pregnancy out of the female body if we are ever going to actually, change any of these sort of structures of oppression. To me, these works express an optimism, sort of a hope that we can use these technologies as tools to create a different society in different ways. There are lots of differences between them, but they all share, I would say, in that sense that there is a possibility, and a potential in these things. But what I think we're seeing is that the tools in themselves are not carriers of progressiveness or a specific kind of change. And what I think we've seen in the way that these tools, these technologies have become part of our everyday reality now is that they become that in the sort of within the framework of neoliberal capitalism, where they become part of logics of commodification of women's bodies and of sort of reproductive materials, gametes, etc. And that's a hard logic to resist. It eats these attempts at become sort of subsumed within that logic. And a lot of the time in a depressingly in a depressing alliance with like conservative family values, where these technologies become ways of allowing women to be mothers, rather than ways of creating new families. And I think that the challenge for speculative fiction now is to imagine these technologies working differently, working outside of the capitalist logic, working outside of these kind of neoliberal, you can choose anything, you can be anything, everybody can, have a child, it's there, it's for you, you can just sort of, anybody who's got money, that is, so you can obviously buy your child. And I see that there's some of that happening in speculative fiction, but it seems to me that there's less of a sort of utopian engagement with these technologies. And I think that that's why, because they have become so enmeshed in this sort of capitalist neoliberal logic. Well, that wasn't very positive.
No. I think there's a large section of science fiction that writes warnings about this kind of technology. You point, to Frankenstein as having a certain warning about the potentialities of science, though I think a lot of the, Frankenstein the novel versus Frankenstein the movie are such difference, right? And the novel, there's a way in which it's his socialization, right? Frankenstein abandons the monster because he's ugly, and it's a novel about failure of family to socialize the child in certain respects that Frank, the monster acts out, but
and the refusal of kinship in terms of, he wants to form new kinship connections, and those are refused to him. So
yeah. The moments of looking through the cabin and longing, watching the family. There's an amazing, the monster as ethnographer there. But I think, Firestone, The Dialectics of Sex, is almost a science fiction book. In many ways, it's more science fiction-y than various novels, right? And for all her problems, particularly around race, I am a fan of Firestone. She's very inspiring to me at a particular point when I read her work. But I would say that she doesn't believe, and I think this is something speculative fiction can help us with. She doesn't believe that the tools on their own is going to solve the problem, right? She would say we need to mechanize reproduction, but then we need to seize the means of reproduction, right? That we need to take these tools out of the circuits of capital. That neoliberalism has been so successful, at capturing. And so and again, I think that's one of the interesting things, in Cherry's work. I kind of am coming back to thinking about Cherry critically these days in terms of reproduction. But, we think about Female Man as a very moving book to me. And I just finished reading We Who Are About To. And that those sort of early feminist stances in terms of critiques around social reproduction again. I'm sort of, what it seems to me that, that speculative fiction has been a really powerful tool for thinking through feminism. Um, but I think it's also been, and Jemisin is certainly thinking with sort of feminist issues, but perhaps we should also think about some of the history around Afrofuturism in Jemisin, right? Because again, when I talk to some of my friends in English literature departments and tell them I work on science fiction, um, they don't envision Native science fiction writers, African American science fiction writers. They may know Octavia Butler, um, but um, what do you think about sort of the the sort of history of Afrofuturism, or because I know you also work on other authors who have been categorized as Afrofuturist. What are sort of some of your thoughts about who's some of the trajectory of Afrofuturism and how it relates to Jemisin's work, or how it works in society at the moment?
Yeah, so Afrofuturism is one of those terms that has a moment of origin. It's coined by Mark Theory in 1993, and it's available as part of an essay called Black to the Future. And it's been that origin has also been criticized because it comes out of a sense that there's a lack of African American specifically engagement with the future, and it comes out of a question of can are African Americans sort of inherently like inescapably stuck in a past that they cannot sort of escape, so that they can't sort of project themselves into the future. So there's been critique around the term from that, but the term sort of took on a life of its own in a way, and became explored by other people and expanded on and sort of claimed by African American communities. And I keep saying African American because in my understanding, it is a very American centered idea or movement. It speaks to the Black diaspora. But if you read interviews with writers who might be, Caribbean writers or writers that are first generation Nigerian, for example, Nigerian American writers, etc., they often feel slightly uncomfortable with the term because it seems to be connected to an African American experience of sort of the afterlife of chattel slavery and the sort of challenges that go with that. But Afrofuturism has become, I would say, a very powerful both artistic and cultural movement particularly in the US, but also, depending on how you categorize it, sort of more globally. But and you have writers, which is obviously my focus as a literary scholar, but also there's a lot of interesting things happening in art and music. Janelle Monáe is one name, somebody I like. You have Sun Ra, again, the older, but they're also starting to draw sort of create histories backwards. So they are creating like lines of development that include people like W.E.B. Du Bois, but also then like the 1960s and 70s Black science fiction writers, Samuel Delaney and Octavia Butler, who already mentioned. And Jemisin sort of says that I never use that label about myself, but obviously my work sort of fits it, shares the concern with sort of Black culture intersecting with technology, but also with like just this imagining the future as being Black. So there's what I feel is sort of might be a danger at the moment is that it becomes a marketing label where rather than a social movement, and that's always a risk when something sort of takes off and becomes popular, is that it becomes commodified. And something to just be aware of that danger, I think.
The market is very, very talented at co-opting terms of resistance and turning them into commodity.
Yeah.
Um, and as science fiction creators, authors, Afrofuturist artists, you still have to sell in the market. Right? We can't pretend that we can just separate from the market. So it is a challenging time. I think movements in African science fiction, whether or not they call themselves Afrofuturist, are exciting at the moment. Tata Thompson, the global. I think some of it is a matter of we're actually getting better translations now at the end of the Cold War, and we're beginning to see that there's been a long-standing international science fiction tradition, and we're starting to see this globally, in part, thanks to some people like Jeff Vandermeer and his wife Anne Vandermeer as editors, who have brought to English just an amazing array of international writings that the English market hadn't ever seen in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when people thought science fiction was just American, and it's so not.
I think
and that's a wonderful moment.
One of the most important transformations we're seeing is we have the rights of both African and Asian science fiction. And as you say, both in English, but also in translation. And this is, I think that I hope that this is something that American science fiction will never sort of recover from,
Yes.
in the sense that it doesn't become dominant the way, or American, but Anglo-American, British and American, that it this kind of these drawing on other traditions of knowledge and other traditions of storytelling that are sort of being integrated in the genre in ways that I think are actually changing the genre in ways that I hope aren't possible to walk back, because so much interesting is happening there that it's really worth building on and appreciating.
And a lot of Latin American women authors who are writing critiques of family and social reproduction. We are beginning to round out the hour. I was going to ask you if you were counseling a friend who had never read N.K. Jemisin, how would you counsel them to start? Where would you counsel them to start? What would you tell them they needed to know going in?
Well, I would ask if they prefer fantasy or science fiction, because Jemisin has written, I would say, mainly what we would recognize as fantasy, or very sort of in the lines of fantasy rather than science fiction. Her Broken Earth trilogy would be if you like science fiction, but then I would say start there, or start with The City We Became, which is currently because it's something I'm just reading and working with now, The City We Became and The World We Make, which is the second novel in that duology. If you want something a little bit closer to home, then The City We Became might be a good place to start. If you really like fantasy, if you like epic fantasy, then I would say that, and if you want to have, if you like these like big trilogies where that you have 1,000 pages ahead of you and you can't wait to just sort of disappear into them, then I think the Inheritance trilogy is an excellent reading experience. So she's really, what I read from at the start from the fifth season is typical of the tone and the voice of Broken Earth, but her voice in The City We Became is a very different voice. There are commonalities, obviously, but they're different. So I would say it depends. My personal favorite, I know I don't have one. They're different. It depends on my mood. If I actually often advise people to start with short stories, because science fiction, speculative fiction, short stories tend to be really good, is my sense. It's a genre that works well in the short story format. And her Cloud Dragon Skies is available online. Cloud Dragon Skies. And I think that's an excellent short story that you can sort of start to get to know. And that's for what you should know. I don't think you really need to know anything when you start reading. You just need to be prepared to listen, because she's got a very distinct voice. And if you're prepared to sort of listen and stay with the pain of what she's telling you, then it's worth it.
I have really enjoyed The City We Became, which also had started with a short story, and I can't remember the short story title, but it is out there. And now yesterday was the last day of the semester, so once I finish my grading, I am looking forward to reading the sequel. So very much so. And for my friends who live in New York or who love the city we became is an obvious
It's a love story.
Obvious place to start.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's her love story, her sort of declaration of love for New York City.
Yeah. If you want to see the boroughs personified, it's a lovely. Unless you want to see good, unless you're on Staten Island, in which case, perhaps not the place to start. Staten Island is not well portrayed. Who are some of the other SF authors that you would encourage people to look at in light of the issues we've been talking about, family and race, and politics and dystopia and hopefully utopia, and who else would you like to recommend people?
Yeah, well, that's the problem right now. There are too many authors out there. I'll just go with my personal favorites, some people I'm reading and working on at the moment. They would be Nnedi Okorafor. She would be like my top of the list. If you haven't read Nnedi Okorafor, you really, really have to. And she's got everything from like an African Harry Potter to the science fiction Lagoon, which is an excellent story of alien contact. Aliens actually want to contact other sapient beings rather than humans on Earth when they come here. So those are two. So that's my top of the list name. Rebecca Roanhorse is a Native American writer who I think is really interesting. Some of her work is pretty gory, and I'm kind of squeamish, so sometimes struggle with that, but it's worth it because she's really interesting. We have Nailo Hopkinson, a slightly earlier generation, more of a classic. There's somebody who's very different, I think, Becky Chambers, who writes sort of lighter stuff in a way, a little bit space opera kind of thing. But she does very interesting things with kinship, exploring different family formations. And especially if you're interested in like alternatives to capitalist ways of living, then a record of a space-born feud is a novel that I think is very worth reading. I guess I better stop there. There are more, so many more.
There are so many.
Yeah.
I guess to sort of close this section of the show, before we see if folks have questions and want to open up the conversation, I was really struck by the way you closed your last paper at the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, and I would wonder, we opened with Jemisin's words, but would you do the honor of closing the show with your words?
Sure, that would be my honor. Thank you. Okay, so that paper was on The City We Became. So I'm speaking about that paper specifically, but I think it goes to Jemisin's works generally. So I'll end then by suggesting that radical politics need radical connections that transform us materially. Our relations with other human beings and with the more than human world constitute us. We become through these relations, refusing the multiplicity of touch, policing lines of separation is a form of violence to the world and to ourselves, a form of violence that Jemisin's novel powerfully persists.
Thank you very much. Um, I think um, I think at the moment, I think it is time for us to close there. We have reached the hour. Jenny, I'd like to thank you so much for being here this afternoon and giving us your time and your contribution. I do want to remind folks that we have a Facebook page that you can visit and help us spread the word through social media. You can also watch our archive of shows on YouTube and find our website at shelterandsolidarity.org. The Saturday Book Show will also be continuing this spring on the last Saturdays of the month at noon Eastern Time. Our next conversation will be with Brent Ryan Bellamy on May 27th about his book, Remainders of the American Century, Post-Apocalyptic Novels in the Age of U.S. Decline, as well as his work on petrofutures and climate fiction. Finally, we would like to thank our sponsors, the Community Church of Boston, Equatro Cinco, or E5, Hardball Press, and the journal Socialism and Democracy for their support. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. Thank you again, Jenny.